Ambassador Vextari of the Silken Collective stood at the observation window of Unity Station and watched the human vessel approach with growing unease in all four of his hearts. The ship was small, barely larger than a diplomatic shuttle. Yet it carried representatives of a species that had only recently discovered faster than light travel and already demanded a seat at the Galactic Union's table. He turned to his assistant, a younger member of his species named Kethril, and spoke in their native tongue of clicks and whistles. Have the decontamination chambers been prepared according to human specifications? Kethril checked the datapad wrapped carefully in protective film and nodded. Yes, Ambassador, though I must confess their requirements are most unusual. They requested only basic atmospheric filtering and temperature adjustment. Nothing more. Vextari's antennae twitched with concern, for every species in the known galaxy required extensive protective measures when visiting shared spaces. The Konvathi needed thermal regulation suits. The Velith required ultraviolet barriers. The crystalline Seath could only travel in pressurized containers filled with their native gases. And even his own people wore 3 layers of contact-resistant membranes at all times. Perhaps they do not understand the dangers, he mused aloud. Or perhaps their translators failed to convey the full scope of potential hazards. We must be patient with such a young species. The docking clamps engaged with a soft thunk that echoed through the station's corridors. And Vextari straightened his ceremonial robes before leading his delegation toward the airlock. Behind him walked 12 other ambassadors representing the Union's founding species, each one encased in their respective protective equipment. Each one curious about these strange newcomers from the small blue world called Earth. The airlock doors hissed open, and Vextari felt his primary heart skip a beat at the sight before him. The humans wore simple cloth garments in dark colors, their feet covered in soft shoes, their hands completely bare, no gloves, no barriers, no protective membranes of any kind. Commander Elena Vasquez stepped forward first, a tall woman with dark hair pulled back from her face and eyes that sparkled with warmth and curiosity. She smiled at the gathered aliens and raised her hand in greeting, palm facing outward. On behalf of Earth and the United Human Coalition, I bring greetings to the Galactic Union, she said, her voice clear and confident through the translator device clipped to her collar. We are honored to be considered for membership in your great assembly. Vextari tried to respond, but his eyes kept drifting to her exposed skin. He could see the fine hairs on her forearm, the subtle texture of her palm, the way her fingers moved freely without any protective covering. It was both fascinating and horrifying. Commander Vasquez, he finally managed to say, I must ask, where is your contact equipment, your thermal shielding, your environmental barriers? Elena looked down at herself and then back at the ambassador with a puzzled expression. I am afraid I do not understand the question. Is something wrong with my uniform? A collective gasp rose from the alien delegation. The Konvathi ambassador clutched his thermal regulator as if it might fly away. The Velith representative's tentacles curled inward with distress, and one of the Seath delegates had to be steadied by her companions to prevent her crystalline form from toppling over. Your skin, Vextari said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. It is exposed. You have nothing protecting you from direct contact with surfaces, with other beings, with the very air itself. Elena exchanged glances with her fellow humans, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, Webb, and a small woman with sharp eyes named Dr. Priya Sharma, and all 3 of them seemed equally confused by the concern. Ambassador, humans do not typically require such protection, Elena explained gently. Our skin is quite resilient. It is designed to interact directly with our environment. Vextari felt dizzy. Designed to interact directly. What kind of evolutionary nightmare had produced such beings? He gestured weakly for the delegation to proceed with the tour, and the group moved through the station's corridors with the humans walking casually among them, Every few steps, one of the aliens would flinch or gasp as they watched the humans touch things. Elena ran her fingers along a railing as she walked, feeling the smooth metal beneath her fingertips without even thinking about it. Marcus leaned against a wall while waiting for a door to open, his shoulder pressing directly against the cold surface. Priya picked up a fallen stylus from the floor and handed it back to a startled Kovathiade, who accepted it only after wrapping it in 3 layers of sanitizing cloth. When they reached the refreshment area, the true horror began. A service drone offered beverages to the delegation, and Elena accepted a cup of heated liquid that the station's computer had synthesized to approximate human coffee. She wrapped her bare hands around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her palms, and took a long sip. "She is touching the heated container," whispered the Velith ambassador in shock, "directly touching it with her skin." "The temperature must be at least 40 degrees above standard," agreed the Korvathi representative, his voice trembling. "She should be screaming in agony." Elena noticed their stares and smiled pleasantly. "Is something the matter? Would you like to try some? It is quite good." 3 delegates fainted on the spot, their protective suits clattering against the floor as their companions rushed to help them. The medical team that arrived minutes later kept shooting nervous glances at the humans, who stood to the side looking thoroughly bewildered by the commotion. "I do not understand," Marcus said quietly to Elena. "All she did was drink coffee. Why are they acting like she swallowed poison?" "I think," Priya replied thoughtfully, "that we may have severely underestimated how different we are from these species. Look at them, Marcus. Every single one is wrapped in layers of protection, and here we are in our dress uniforms with our hands and faces completely exposed." The realization began to dawn on the human delegation. They were not just visitors from another world. They were something impossible, something that defied everything these aliens understood about biological safety. That evening, Vexthari sat in his private quarters and dictated an urgent report to the Union Council. His appendages trembled as he spoke, and his assistant Kethril stood nearby, equally shaken by the day's events. "The human species presents an unprecedented anomaly," he began. "Their biology appears to have developed without any of the standard contact protection mechanisms that every other known species possesses. They touch everything: walls, floors, containers, equipment, each other, without any apparent harm or distress." He paused, trying to find words that would adequately convey what he had witnessed. "Today, I observed a human female consume a heated beverage by wrapping her bare hands around the thermal container. I watched a human male lean his full body weight against an unshielded metal wall for several minutes. I saw a human scientist pick up a foreign object from the floor and handle it without any decontamination procedures whatsoever." Kethril added quietly, "Should I include the incident where the commander scratched her own face, directly touched her facial membrane with her own appendages?" Vexthari shuddered at the memory. "Yes, include that as well. The council must understand the full scope of what we are dealing with." He concluded his report with a warning that he hoped would be taken seriously. The humans appear to have no concept of contact danger. They interact with their environment in ways that would be fatal to any other species. I recommend extreme caution in all future dealings with them. Not because they are hostile, they seem quite friendly, but because they may genuinely not understand how terrifying their behavior appears to the rest of the galaxy. They touch everything, counselors, and I do not think they even realize how remarkable that is. The report was transmitted to all Union Council members within the hour. By the next morning, the phrase "untouchable ones" had begun to spread through diplomatic channels, and humanity had earned a reputation that would follow them for centuries to come, the species that could touch anything and survive. 3 months had passed since humanity joined the Galactic Union, and the research vessel Constellation had become something of a legend among the alien species. Wherever the ship traveled, Stories followed stories of humans doing impossible things with their bare hands, touching surfaces that would kill any sensible creature, and acting as if it were the most normal thing in the universe. Chief Engineer Marcus Webb stood in the engine room reviewing maintenance logs when the distress call came through. The signal was weak and crackling with interference, but the fear in the transmission was unmistakable. "This is Captain Yolmesh of the Corvette mining vessel Bright Fortune," the voice said. "We have suffered a catastrophic coolant breach in Cargo Bay 7 cryogenic. Fluid has flooded the entire section, and temperatures have dropped to negative 140 degrees standard. We have 17 crew members trapped behind emergency barriers, and our oxygen recyclers are frozen solid without them. We have perhaps 2 hours of breathable air remaining." Commander Elena Vasquez responded immediately. "Bright Fortune, this is the Constellation. We are en route to your position and will arrive in approximately 40 minutes. Can you hold on that long?" "We will try, Commander, but our situation is desperate. We have no way to retrieve the recycler units from the frozen bay. The cold would kill any of us in seconds, and all our manipulator drones have malfunctioned due to the temperature." Marcus felt something stir in his chest, that familiar human instinct that had driven his ancestors to run into burning buildings and dive into frozen rivers to save strangers. He made his way to the bridge and found Elena already coordinating rescue efforts. "What is the exact temperature in their cargo bay?" Marcus asked. Elena glanced at the sensor readings. Negative 142 degrees, with cryogenic mist reducing visibility to nearly zero. "The Kavathi cannot survive exposure for more than a few seconds." "What about us?" The bridge fell silent. The Velos science officer, who had been assigned to the Constellation as part of a cultural exchange program, stared Marcus with something between horror and disbelief. "You cannot be serious," she said, her tentacles writhing with anxiety. "No organic being can survive in such conditions." Marcus shrugged. "I have worked in cold environments before, not quite that cold, but humans are adaptable. With proper insulation on my hands and feet, I could probably make a few trips into that bay and retrieve what they need." "A few trips," the Veloth repeated. "Into an environment that would flash freeze your vital fluids in moments?" "My vital fluids are tougher than you might think," Marcus replied with a grin. When the Constellation reached the Bright Fortune, Marcus was already suited up, though the Kavathi rescue team that met them in the docking bay could hardly believe what they saw. The human was wearing insulated gloves, thick boots, a thermal jacket, and a simple face covering that left much of his skin still exposed to the air. "Where is your cryogenic survival suit?" demanded Captain Yolmesh, a reptilian being wrapped in so many layers of thermal protection that he could barely move. "This is my cryogenic survival suit," Marcus replied. Yolmesh looked at his own crew, wrapped in their bulky equipment, and then back at the human who appeared to be dressed for a mild winter day. "You will die in there. You understand this, yes?" "I understand that your crew will die if someone does not get those recyclers," Marcus said firmly. "Now show me where Cargo Bay 7 is." The journey through the ship was tense. Kavathi crew members pressed themselves against walls as Marcus passed, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Word had spread about the humans and their impossible abilities, but seeing one prepare to walk into certain death was something else entirely. They reached the sealed doors of Cargo Bay 7, and Marcus could feel the cold radiating from the metal even before they opened. Frost covered every surface, and the air that escaped when the emergency seal cracked was so cold it made his lungs ache. "The recycler units are approximately 50 meters inside," Yolmesh said through chattering teeth. "Large cylindrical objects near the far wall. You will need to retrieve at least 2 for us to have any chance of survival." Marcus nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped through the doorway. The cold hit him like a physical force. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. A biting, burning sensation that seemed to sink straight through his skin and into his bones. The cryogenic mist swirled around him, reducing visibility to just a few feet, but he pushed forward with determination. His breath came out in thick white clouds that froze almost instantly. Ice crystals began to form on his exposed face and in his beard. His muscles screamed with every step, and yet he kept moving, kept pushing through the frozen hell, because somewhere ahead were machines that could save 17 lives. He found the first recycler unit buried under a layer of frost and wrapped his gloved hands around it. The cold bit through the insulated material, making his fingers ache, but he lifted the heavy cylinder and began the long walk back to the door. When he emerged from the cargo bay, the Kavathi crew stared at him as if witnessing the resurrection of the dead. Frost covered his entire body. His skin had turned an alarming shade of red, and ice hung from his beard like tiny crystals. But he was alive, and he was carrying their salvation. "One down," he said through numb lips. "3 more to go." "3 more?" Yolmesh gasped. "You cannot go back in there. You are already showing signs of severe cold exposure." Marcus handed the recycler to a waiting crew member and shook the frost from his jacket. "Your people need those units." "I will be fine, just have some hot coffee ready when I am done." He made 3 more trips into that frozen nightmare. Each time, the cold seemed to bite deeper. Each time his body protested more loudly, and each time he ignored it and kept going. The Kavathi watched through the doorway, unable to process what they were seeing: a soft, organic being walking repeatedly into conditions that should have killed him instantly. On his 4th trip, Marcus stumbled and nearly fell. His legs had grown stiff and unresponsive, and his vision was starting to blur around the edges. He grabbed the final recycler unit and half-carried, half-dragged it back toward the light of the doorway. When he finally collapsed through the seal and into the warmth of the corridor, the Kavathi medical team rushed forward with thermal blankets and heating units. They pressed the devices against his frozen skin, watching in amazement as color slowly returned to his face. "Your skin," one of the medics said in wonder. "It touched the frozen air directly. I can see the damage on your face, the crystallization on your extremities, and yet you are still alive." Marcus accepted a cup of hot liquid that someone pressed into his trembling hands. The warmth of the cup against his palms felt like heaven, and he wrapped his fingers around it gratefully. "Yeah, it is pretty cold in there. I am definitely going to feel this tomorrow." Captain Yolmesh knelt beside the human, his reptilian eyes glistening with what might have been tears. "You saved us. You walked into death itself and saved my entire crew. How can I ever repay such a debt?" "Just spread the word," Marcus said with a tired smile. "Humans are not as fragile as we look. We have been dealing with extreme temperatures since before we discovered fire. We are built to survive." The story of Marcus Webb and the frozen cargo bay spread through the Union like wildfire. Within days, every species in the galaxy knew about the human who had walked repeatedly into temperatures that would have killed anyone else instantly. They called it a miracle, an impossibility, a testament to the terrifying resilience of the human species. In the official Union database, humanity's entry was quietly updated with a new note: confirmed ability to withstand extreme temperature variations. Recommend further study of human thermal tolerance limits, if such limits exist. And in the mess hall of the Constellation, Marcus Webb sat with his feet propped up near a heating vent, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and complaining mildly about the tingling sensation in his fingers. His crewmates laughed and clapped him on the shoulder, and none of them seemed to realize that they had just rewritten everything the galaxy thought it knew about the limits of organic life. The Galactic Union faced a crisis that threatened the very foundation of interstellar civilization. The mineral known as tesseract, essential for faster-than-light drive cores, was running dangerously low. and the only known deposit large enough to meet galactic demand lay beneath the surface of a world called Desirix. But Desirix was a death world in every sense of the term. Union scientists had cataloged 17 different compounds in its atmosphere that were lethal to every known species. The soil registered as highly acidic, capable of eating through standard protective equipment in minutes. The water sources contained heavy metals and toxins that would destroy organic tissue on contact. And even the air itself carried microscopic particles that could shred respiratory systems from the inside out. The planet is simply uninhabitable, declared the Velith Science Council in their official report. We recommend seeking alternative sources for Thesserite, even if such sources take centuries to develop. The Union Council debated for weeks, watching their reserves dwindle and their ships grow slower. Without Thesserite, the great web of trade and diplomacy that held the galaxy together would begin to unravel, and there seemed to be no solution. Then humanity made an offer. Dr. Priya Sharma stood before the assembled council, a small woman with dark hair and calm eyes, and presented her proposal with the quiet confidence that had become humanity's trademark. We will survey Desirix. We will establish a mining operation. We will extract the Thesserite you need. The council chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates shouted over one another, some calling the humans insane, others accusing them of mockery, and a few simply laughing at the absurdity of the suggestion. Ambassador Vexthari, who had become something of an expert on human behavior since that first fateful meeting, raised his appendages for silence. Let her speak. I have learned not to underestimate what these beings can do. Priya nodded gratefully. We have reviewed the environmental data from Desirix, and while I will not pretend the conditions are pleasant, they are not beyond human endurance. Our species evolved on a world that many of you would consider nearly as hostile. We have developed natural resistances to a wide range of environmental hazards. Your world, said the Seath representative slowly. We have heard rumors about Earth, but we assumed they were exaggerated. Surely no civilization could arise on a planet as dangerous as the reports suggest. Priya smiled. Earth has deserts where temperatures exceed 50 degrees and can kill an unprotected person in hours. It has polar regions where exposed flesh freezes in minutes. It has jungles filled with venomous creatures and plants that cause chemical burns on contact. It has oceans full of predators and regions where the ground itself can swallow you whole. And yet, here we are. She pulled up a holographic display showing side by side comparisons of Earth's most hostile environments and Desirix. Your toxic world is dangerous. Yes, but the compounds in its atmosphere are similar to pollutants that human industrial workers have developed tolerances to over generations. The acidity of the soil is comparable to regions on Earth where humans have successfully farmed for centuries. Even the heavy metals in the water, while harmful, are things our species has learned to filter and process. The council fell silent, processing this information with varying degrees of horror and fascination. 3 months later, the first human survey team landed on Desirix. Priya led the expedition personally, stepping out onto the planet's surface in nothing more than a standard hazmat suit, the kind humans use for cleaning up chemical spills on Earth. Not the military-grade exo-armor that other species would require for such an environment. The air burned in her nostrils, and she could taste the metallic tang of the atmosphere even through her respirator. The ground beneath her boots hissed slightly where the acidic soil made contact with her equipment, and in the distance she could see pools of liquid that glowed faintly with toxic radiation. It reminds me of some industrial sites back home, she reported into her recorder. Hostile, but manageable. The acid content in the soil is actually lower than I expected. With proper treatment, we might even be able to grow certain crops here. The alien observers' monitorum orbit went completely silent. They had expected the humans to last perhaps an hour before retreating in defeat. Instead, The survey team was already setting up equipment and taking samples as if they were on a routine field study. Over the following weeks, the human team did something that the Union xenobiologists had never documented in real time. They adapted. Their skin grew thicker and more resistant to the chemical irritants in the air. Their lungs adjusted to filter out more of the harmful particles. Their digestive systems learned to process food grown in the acidic soil. Calluses formed on their hands and feet, creating natural barriers against the corrosive elements. Humans have an extraordinary capacity for biological adaptation, Dr. Sharma explained during one of her regular updates to the Council. Given enough exposure to challenging environments, our bodies literally rebuild themselves to better handle the stress. It is how we survived on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years before we developed technology. By the 6th month, a permanent human base had been established on Nesarix. The miners who arrived to begin extraction work grumbled about the uncomfortable conditions, but treated them as an occupational hazard rather than an existential threat. They wore their protective gear when necessary and shed it when the environment allowed, moving through the toxic landscape with the casual confidence of people who had simply accepted that their world was trying to kill them. A delegation of Velith scientists arrived in a specially designed vessel to study the human operation. They watched from behind multiple layers of protective shielding as human workers handled Thesserite ore with gloved hands, walked through clouds of chemical mist, and took breaks in areas that would have been instantly lethal to any other species. How is this possible? The lead scientist asked Dr. Sharma during an interview conducted through 17 different safety barriers. Your species has only been technologically advanced for a few centuries. How have you developed such resistance to environmental hazards? Priya considered the question carefully. I think you misunderstand our history. Humans did not develop these resistances through technology. We developed them through millions of years of survival on a planet that was actively trying to murder us. She began to list the dangers of Earth, and the Velith scientist grew paler with each item. We had predators that could outrun us, outswim us, and outfight us. We had weather patterns that could destroy entire settlements in minutes. We had diseases that evolved faster than we could develop cures. We had venomous insects, poisonous plants, toxic fungi, parasites that could live inside our bodies, and water sources contaminated with bacteria that killed millions before we learned to purify them. The scientist's recording device trembled in her appendage. And your species survived all of this. We did more than survive, Priya said quietly. We thrived. We spread across our entire world, from the frozen poles to the scorching equator, from the highest mountains to the deepest valleys. We learned to touch the dangerous things because avoiding them meant death, and somewhere along the way, we became very, very hard to kill. The Velith scientist requested a complete geological and biological history of Earth. The files were transmitted to her vessel that night, and according to later reports, she did not sleep for 11 standard cycles after reading them. Word of humanity's success on Desarix spread throughout the Union. The impossible mining operation became the largest source of Thesserite in known space, and humans earned a new title among the alien species, the Touched, beings who could make contact with things that would destroy anyone else. And in the deepening twilight of Desarix, Dr. Priya Sharma stood outside the main base with her respirator removed, breathing the toxic air in small doses to continue building her tolerance. The sky above was a sickly orange color. The ground beneath her feet still hissed with acid, and the whole planet reeked of chemicals that should have killed her months ago. She smiled and took another breath, feeling the familiar burn in her lungs. Humans, she said to no one in particular, we touch the things that hurt us, and somehow we make them ours. The hollow came without warning, as they always did. They were not a species in any traditional sense. They were a parasitic hive organism that spread from world to world, consuming all organic matter in their path. Their bodies were made of a corrosive membrane that could dissolve flesh, metal, and even some forms of energy shielding on contact. They had destroyed 17 civilizations before the Galactic Union formed, and in all the centuries since, no one had ever found a way to fight them. When the Hollow appeared on Station Meridian, the Union's largest trading hub with over 2 million inhabitants, the response was immediate and desperate. Evacuation. Ships launched from every dock, carrying as many people as their holds could fit. Emergency shuttles broke away from the station's outer ring. Even cargo vessels pressed into service, their crews throwing out valuable goods to make room for refugees. But evacuation took time, and the Hollow did not wait. Commander Elena Vasquez watched the tactical display aboard the Union defense ship, Vigilance, as the parasites spread through Station Meridian's lower levels, like a living stain. Every minute, more sections of the station went dark, their populations consumed or fled. Current evacuation estimate is 6 hours, reported the Corvati tactical officer. At their current rate of expansion, the Hollow will reach the central hub in 4. We cannot save everyone. Elena turned to her crew humans from Earth's United Defense Force, soldiers who had trained their entire lives for impossible situations. We are not going to let that happen. We are going boarding that station, and we are going to hold the line until every single person is evacuated. The alien officers on the bridge stared at her in disbelief. Commander, you cannot fight the Hollow. Their acidic membrane dissolves all organic matter on contact. No species has ever survived direct combat with them. No species, Elena agreed. Until now, the human assault team numbered only 50 soldiers. But they carried something more valuable than numbers: knowledge gained from months of research into the Hollow's biology. Dr. Priya Sharma had discovered that the parasites' acidic membrane could be neutralized by petroleum-based compound substances that humans had been handling with bare hands for centuries. Their tactical suits were coated with a protective layer, but even without it, the acid would only cause what humans considered minor chemical burns rather than instant death. Sergeant Kofi Asante led the first squad through the airlock and into the infested section of Station Meridian. The corridor ahead was covered in the Hollow's organic growth pulsing, writhing masses of parasitic tissue that spread across walls, floors, and ceiling like a living carpet. Contact ahead, he reported calmly. Looks like they have completely taken over this section. I count at least 30 drones and one hive node requesting permission to engage. Permission granted, Elena's voice crackled through his communicator. Show them what humans are made of. Kofi raised his weapon and fired. The plasma bolt tore through the first Hollow drone, spattering its acidic remains across the corridor. The other drones surged forward, their membrane-covered bodies undulating with terrible purpose, and the human soldiers met them head-on. What followed was unlike anything the Galactic Union had ever witnessed. Private Chun grabbed a Hollow drone that had latched onto his arm and physically ripped it in half, ignoring the acid that splashed across his gloves and forearms. Corporal Rodriguez stomped on a cluster of parasitic growths that had been creeping toward a group of trapped civilians, crushing them beneath her boots, even as the acid ate through the solace. Sergeant Azante himself tore into the hive node with his bare hands, his fingers sinking into the corrosive mass as he ripped out its central core. Their acid burns, Kofi reported over comms, shaking the residue from his hands and watching the skin beneath turn red and blistered. It is like a bad sunburn. Keep moving. The alien survivors watching from behind emergency barriers could not process what they were seeing. The Hollow extinction incarnate, the end of worlds. The unstoppable plague was being touched, grabbed, and torn apart by creatures that treated its deadly acid as a minor inconvenience. The battle raged for hours. Human squads pushed through level after level of infested station, clearing paths for evacuees and destroying hive nodes wherever they found them. They accumulated burns, cuts, and injuries that would have been fatal to any other species. But they kept fighting, kept moving, kept touching the things that should have killed them. Private Yuki Tanaka became a legend that day. She had been leading a group of Veloth refugees toward an evacuation point when a hollow surge breached the corridor behind them. The emergency airlock was their only escape, but the control panel had been damaged. The door would not seal automatically. "Get through," she shouted, pushing the terrified aliens toward the opening. "I will hold the door." The Veloth fled past her, and Yuki grabbed the airlock door with both hands, pulling it closed against the pressure differential that fought to keep it open. The vacuum of space pulled at her from one side, while the hollow surge crashed against the barrier from the other. Her hands burned from the cold metal. The seal was imperfect, and wisps of frozen air licked at her exposed skin. She could feel the temperature dropping, feel the ice crystals forming on her face, feel her fingers going numb as she held the door with every ounce of strength in her body. 3 minutes. For 3 minutes, Yuki Tanaka held that door closed with her bare hands, while the emergency seal slowly engaged behind her. She felt the frostbite setting in, felt 2 of her fingers lose all sensation, felt her vision starting to blur at the edges. When the seal finally clicked into place and the door locked, she collapsed against it and laughed a weak, exhausted sound that turned into a sob of relief. The Veloth refugees stared at her from the other side of the transparent barrier, their faces showing an emotion that Yuki had never seen on an alien before. "Ah, your hands," one of them whispered through the intercom. "You held the door with your hands in the vacuum with the cold. How are you still alive?" Yuki looked down at her damaged fingers. 2 of them had turned black with frostbite, the nerves destroyed by the extreme cold, and she shrugged. "I will request a desk job for a few weeks while they regrow. We have good medical technology back on Earth." "They will regrow?" The Veloth repeated in disbelief. "Human bodies are very good at fixing themselves," Yuki said. "It is one of our better features." By the time the last evacuation ship departed Station Meridian, the Hollow had been completely eradicated from every section that humans had defended. The parasites that had consumed 17 civilizations, that had been considered unstoppable by every species in the galaxy, had met something they could not digest. Commander Elena Vasquez stood in the station's central hub, surrounded by the remnants of the battle acid burns on the walls, destroyed hive nodes scattered across the floor, and her soldiers sitting exhausted but victorious among the ruins. "Casualties?" she asked her second-in-command. 12 wounded, 2 seriously. Private Tanaka lost 2 fingers, but is expected to make a full recovery. Sergeant Asanti has second-degree chemical burns on 60% of his hands. He is requesting to return to duty by next week. Elena nodded, allowing herself a small smile. "Tell medical to patch them up. We have a reputation to maintain." The Union Council met in emergency session 3 days later. The topic of discussion was humanity's new threat classification. "They fought the Hollow," the Seath representative said, her crystalline voice trembling. "They touched them with their bare hands and tore them apart. No species has ever done this." "They held airlocks closed with their bodies," added the Korvathi representative, "in vacuum conditions, with temperatures that should have killed them instantly, and they survived." Ambassador Vexthari, who had been humanity's first contact and had watched their impossible journey with growing amazement, spoke carefully. "I recommend we upgrade humanity's threat classification from minimal to apex concern. They are clearly among the most dangerous species in the known galaxy." The vote was unanimous. When Elena received word of the classification change, she called a meeting with her command staff and read the decision aloud. The humans listened in silence, and then Marcus Webb raised his hand. "Ambassador Vexthari knows we are allies, right?" he asked. "We are not going to attack anyone. We just want to help." Elena smiled. I reminded him of that. Apparently, the Council finds our helpfulness almost as terrifying as our combat abilities. The room erupted in laughter, and somewhere in the depths of space, the legend of humanity continued to grow, the species that could touch anything, survive anything, and fight anything, all while insisting they were just trying to be friendly. 100 years had passed since that first moment when Commander Elena Vasquez extended her bare hand in greeting to a horrified alien ambassador. 100 years of humans touching things they should not touch, surviving conditions they should not survive, and slowly changing everything the galaxy thought it knew about the limits of life. Humanity had become the Union's first responders, their emergency specialists, their impossible situation solvers. When environments were too hostile, when materials were too dangerous, when contact was required with things that no other species could safely touch, humans answered the call. They had walked through fire and ice, breathed toxic air, and filtered poison water. They had fought parasites that dissolved flesh and survived radiation that should have destroyed their cells. They had touched the galaxy's deadliest threats with their bare hands, and somehow, impossibly, always came back for more. And yet, for all their legendary resilience, the humans themselves seemed strangely unimpressed by their own abilities. They called their feats just doing our job, and their survival nothing special, as if walking into certain death and walking out again was simply what anyone would do in their situation. Elder diplomat Lucia Vasquez stood before the mirror in her quarters aboard Unity Station, adjusting her ceremonial robes and thinking about her grandmother. Elena had passed away 30 years ago, surrounded by family and friends. Her hand held gently by beings from a dozen different species who had learned to overcome their fear of touch because one human woman had shown them it was possible. Today was the Centennial Summit, 100 years of humanity's membership in the Galactic Union, and Lucia had been chosen to deliver the keynote address. 10,000 delegates from every known species would be watching, and she knew exactly what she wanted to say. The Grand Assembly Hall was the largest enclosed space in the known galaxy, a massive dome that could hold representatives from every Union member world. Lucia walked to the central podium and looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some alien beyond description, and felt the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders. Ambassador Vextari was there, ancient now but still serving his people with the same dedication he had shown a century ago. Beside him sat the descendants of Captain Yolmesh, the Kovathi whose life had been saved by Marcus Webb's impossible walk through frozen death. Representatives of the Velith and the Seath filled their designated sections, their protective barriers significantly lighter than they had been 100 years ago. Lucia took a deep breath and began to speak. 1 century ago, my grandmother came to this station with her hands bare and her heart open. She did not know that her simple gesture of greeting would terrify an entire delegation, or that her willingness to touch a hot cup of coffee would cause 3 ambassadors to faint. She was just being human. A soft ripple of laughter passed through the assembly. The story of Elena's first day had become legendary, told and retold until it had taken on the quality of myth. In the years since, my species has earned many names among your peoples, Lucia continued. The untouchable ones, the touched, the barehanded, all of them references to our strange ability to make contact with things that would harm or kill any other beings. You have watched us walk through fire and ice, breathe poison, and survive acid, hold airlocks closed with our naked flesh, and fight monsters with our bare hands. She paused, looking out at the thousands of faces watching her. And I think you have misunderstood us. The assembly fell silent. This was not the triumphant speech they had expected. You call us the untouchable ones because you believe our skin makes us invulnerable, Lucia said. But that is not true. Everything we touch hurts us. Every extreme temperature damages our tissues. Every toxic chemical burns our cells. Every act of impossible endurance comes with a cost that we pay in pain and recovery. She held up her hands, turning them so the audience could see. These hands are not special. They are soft flesh and fragile bone, just like any other organic appendage. They freeze in cold, burn in heat, and dissolve in acid, perhaps not as quickly as your hands, but the damage is real. Murmurs of confusion spread through the crowd. If humans were not invulnerable, how had they accomplished such impossible feats? Lucia smiled. The difference is not in our bodies, it is in our minds. We touch dangerous things not because we cannot be hurt, but because we have learned that some things are worth the pain. She stepped away from the podium and walked toward the front row of delegates, where Ambassador Vexthare sat watching her with ancient, knowing eyes. My grandmother told me a story once, Lucia said, about the first time she shook your hand, Ambassador. She said you recoiled as if she had offered you poison, and she could not understand why until much later in her culture. Extending an open hand is a sign of trust, of peace, of connection. By reaching out to you, she was saying, I am willing to risk being hurt in order to know you. Vexthare's antennae trembled with emotion. He remembered that moment as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. On our world, Lucia continued, we learned very early that survival required connection. Our ancestors lived in groups because a single human was easy prey for the predators that hunted them. They shared food and shelter because alone, the harsh environment would have killed them. They reached out to touch each other, to hold hands, to embrace, to comfort, because in a world that was constantly trying to kill them, contact with another being was often the only thing that kept them alive. She reached out and took Vexthare's appendage in her hand, feeling the texture of his skin against her palm. We touch because we must. Because our world taught us that connection requires risk. Because to help someone, to truly help them, you must be willing to reach for them even when it hurts. The old ambassador's eyes glistened. 100 years of working with humans, and he had never understood them as clearly as he did in this moment. Lucia turned back to the assembly. You have spent a century watching us do impossible things, and you have concluded that we are dangerous, and perhaps you are right. A species that will walk through fire to save a stranger, that will hold an airlock closed with their bare hands to protect people they have never met, that will fight monsters with nothing but their flesh and their determination. Such a species could be terrifying. She released Vexthare appendage and walked back to the podium. But we are not dangerous because we can touch anything. We are human because we choose to reach out, to make contact, to bridge the gap between ourselves and others, even when it means risking pain and damage and death. The assembly was completely silent now. Thousands of beings from hundreds of species, all watching a single human woman speak words that would change everything. For 100 years, you have kept your barriers up around us, Lucia said softly. Your protective suits, your contact shields, your careful distances, and we have understood. Because we know how frightening it can be to touch something unknown. But today, on this anniversary of our first meeting, I want to offer you the same gift my grandmother offered Ambassador Vexthare. She removed her gloves slowly, deliberately, placing them on the podium for all to see. I offer you my bare hands. I offer you the risk of connection. I offer you the human way of reaching out across the void between us and saying, I am willing to be heard if it means knowing you. For a long moment, nothing happened. The assembly sat frozen, uncertain, afraid. Then Ambassador Vexthare rose from his seat, his ancient joints creaking with the effort. He walked slowly toward the podium, his protective membrane still covering his appendages, and stopped before Lucia. For 100 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I have watched your species touch the untouchable. I have seen you embrace pain and danger with a courage that I could not understand. And I have been afraid not of your strength, but of my own weakness. He began to remove his membranes, one layer at a time. Today, I choose to be brave. Today, I choose to touch. His bare appendage reached out and clasped Lucia's hand. The contact was strange for both of them, her soft warmth against his cool scales, but neither pulled away. And then something magical began to happen. One by one, delegates throughout the assembly began to remove their barriers. Protective suits were unzipped, contact shields were deactivated, membranes were peeled away. Appendages of every shape and size reached toward neighboring delegates, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. A Vela scientist touched the crystalline surface of a Sith diplomat. A Kovathi trader clasped hands with a human merchant. Beings who had never made unshielded contact with anything outside their own species experienced the sensation of another's life force pressed against their own. Some wept, some laughed. Some simply stood in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the flood of new sensations. For the first time in galactic history, the Union was truly united, not by treaties or trade agreements, but by the simple act of reaching out and touching. Lucia watched it all with tears streaming down her face, and she thought of her grandmother, of Marcus and Priya and Kofi and Yuki and all the humans who had paved the way for this moment. They had walked through fire and ice, breathed poison and fought monsters, not to prove how strong they were, but to show the galaxy that some things were worth the risk.